Welcome to the gallery at El Zaguán, located at 545 Canyon Road. On view is an exhibition by Darrah Blackwater titled Allocations, Self-Determination from Inside the Earth Outward. This exhibition is on view through April 11th.
What I tried to do with this show is kind of tell it multiple different ways so that you can grasp onto an idea and follow that, because all of these things that I'm talking about in this show are non-tangible and it's invisible, and so it's really kind of hard to wrap your head around because it's not something you can touch or see. It starts with the land. I hiked the Colorado Trail as soon as I was done with law school because I spent 3 years just being in a building, talking about land and talking about rights and talking about minerals. I wanted to get out and see it. And that's exactly what I did. It was in 2020 is when I graduated. And as the world was shut down, I just went into the woods and I hiked from Denver to Durango, which is about 500 miles. And as I was out there, as I think you do as a Native person, but especially as a Native attorney, I noticed the erasure on a lot of trail signs. If you're an avid hiker, you realize that a lot of times trail signs, the story of that place starts with the pioneers and with the industry. Like in the 1800s, they started mining timber out here or whatever it is, or even being out at 10,000 feet and seeing these wide open mines in Colorado. It really drove home like everything that I had just learned through law school. So we start with the land because what this show is about, which is radio waves, electromagnetic spectrum. The way that it's valued is in a geographic base, which, jumping over here for a second, is what this piece is about. This piece, if you can imagine a radio tower in the middle of it, when you get closer, you can see it trace a map of Oklahoma without the panhandle. That is like a spectrum footprint, if you will, because if you can imagine a tower in the middle of each circle, that's how you can blast signal out around that tower. And I did this with earth pigment acrylic that I made, gathered from around Navajo Nation and New Mexico, those earth pigments, because coming back, the spectrum is only as good as the power that you put into the tower and the people that are using it on the land. And so it really starts with the land, ends with the land. And I always kind of think of it as one of the most valuable resources that we have in the modern era. So we're talking about land and we're talking about frequencies that go through the air. So going to the next one, it's a government chart of how we use all of our radio frequencies. So the government puts this out. The last one I think was updated in 2016 is that chart, and those blocks show how we use different frequencies. So one frequency might be set aside for use for maritime mobile, for ships to communicate with each other. Another one might be for satellites, like Elon Musk, that SpaceX would want to buy and use. Another one might be for TV broadcasting, for them to send TV signals through the air. Another one might be for radio. And so essentially what happens every 10 years is that these licenses are sold by the Federal Communications Commission. They go up for auction. AT&T, Verizon, all these big companies bid on them. And then the FCC sells them the license. So a license is essentially, it's just like, sort of like buying land, but it's for 10 years. And so they have this license to use that particular frequency for whatever they want within certain power limits. And they give that money to the FCC, which goes into Treasury. The United States has made $284 billion off of spectrum licenses since the 90s when they started doing auctions. So every 10 years, these licenses come up for auction and they do it again. So it's infinitely economically viable for the US to keep doing this. So my argument from a Native policies perspective is on tribal lands, tribes should have access to every single one of those frequencies that you see on that chart because it's a natural resource, but that's not what's happening right now. Right now, it's just indiscriminately sold by the US, and tribes, one, don't even get to use the frequencies other than a limited few that we'll talk about. And two, that money goes to US Treasury. None of that money comes back to the tribe. So it's really double disenfranchisement of rights for Indigenous people. And then we see that manifest in the digital divide on tribal lands. That if you've ever driven through the Navajo Nation or driven on a lot of tribal lands, we don't have a lot of connection. Your cell service goes out. There's not a place you can pull over and use Wi-Fi easily. And that's partially because of spectrum. This is my version of an actual 1910 Department of Interior flyer, that the original one, maybe you've seen it, it said Indian land for sale. So this was sort of like, as westward expansion was continuing to roll out in America, the message that the government was putting out was, we've tamed the Indians, don't worry about them anymore. You can come out here and there's land available and you can come buy this land. And now we're 116 years beyond that, but now the resource that we're talking about is spectrum. So it's a comment on similar policies that the federal government used for land and indigenous people, but now we're talking about spectrum. It's also a very valuable natural resource. We don't get a say in whether it's sold out from under us or whether we get to use it, but the government's kind of opening it up to make money off of. And so it's sort of same policy, different century, different resource. These are, as you can probably tell, pieces of the spectrum chart. And this one, I put Old J, which is the moon. And so it's a nod, this one and the one in the back, which has Johanna A, which is the sun bearer. These go together because spectrum comes from sun. The UV rays that warm your skin and the infrared light that comes from the sun, or that burn your skin rather, and the heat and the light, these are all different types of spectrum. They're different wavelengths of spectrum. And so as we think about it, the Navajo, we really look to the moon and the sun as these important deities and these important beings in the way that we see the world. And when you look back to art that indigenous people have done forever, I looked a lot to Paso Day or Harrison Begay or Gerald Naylor, who's my favorite Navajo painter. And when you look all the way back to the 50s, you can see them making art with these deities, with Navajo cosmology, with rainbows, which is also spectrum, and the sun and the moon, these really important beings in the way that we understand the world and where we came from, and these people that help us and who's important. These are my nod to some of the Indian school painters who have been making this art with these deities in them for decades and decades. These are sweetgrass that have DSL copper internet cable running through them. So this is about connecting with each other and the way that we communicate from one another on Earth, and then the way that we send prayers upward and communicate with deities above us. This is the 2.5 gigahertz, which is actually a study for a mural at CCA, the Center for Contemporary Arts, a massive mural that I did last year, and those are the study for them. So that's how I was doing the measuring and calculating of how to get these figures on the wall. I think there's 18 of them on that mural. I did one for each tribe that was actually able to access the 2.5 gigahertz through the federal government's licensing window in 2020. So each tribe that has that frequency, has the right to it on their land, is represented on that mural with one of these patterns. And then the watercolors in the back are earth pigments. They're watercolors that I created with earth pigments, with soil that I gathered around the Navajo Nation and around New Mexico. That was me wrapping my mind around the idea that maybe we would do it different. If and when tribes have the rights to all of the frequencies or more of the frequencies on our land, the way that it's organized as far as the licenses and the rights go are reflective of how a government values what they're using it for. And so it's sort of like, well, maybe if we had all of our frequencies, maybe we wouldn't use them all. Maybe they wouldn't be used in sacred places. Maybe they wouldn't be used during certain times, like during an eclipse. That's a really sacred time for Navajo people. And maybe frequencies go quiet then, and it's just more about emergency services during that time. And so each one of those is just me contemplating, how could we do it different? Maybe they would look the same, because we are also a government that has economics and wants to bring in money, and those are valuable resources.